Hello and happy Monday to one and all. Welcome to Motivating Monday. I'm hoping that you've had a great weekend and are raring to go for this week ahead. Last week, I spoke briefly about the case for labor, and I hope through that you have been reminded that God knows our labors, that we are to labor for the meat that is eternal, and that our reward and rest from our labors comes from the Lord, who knows our labors. This week, we are coming on the heels of the marriage retreat. For those who attended the retreat, I believe we have had a lot of learnings and take homes, and I certainly hope it has been beneficial to you. At the same time, the church is also comprised of members who are unmarried. I felt it is important for us to consider the case for the unmarried in today's sharing. First, who are the unmarried? Those who never have been married, and perhaps those whose marriages have ended or been dissolved. Next, is there anything wrong with being unmarried? Well, certainly not. Marriage is neither a requirement for salvation, nor was marriage imposed on the believers at the time of Jesus and the apostles. Otherwise, people like the Ethiopian eunuch would not be rejoicing over his salvation in Acts 8, verse 39. On the contrary, we have the exhortation of Apostle Paul, who was a bachelor, and he spoke regarding the unmarried in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Firstly, what he's about to say is not a requirement. He speaks from concession and not commandment, as he expounds in verse 6. And that he has no commandment of the Lord, that this is his judgment in verse 25. And this is also for the present distress in verse 26. His judgments for the unmarried are that it is good for the unmarried and the widows to remain as he is, a bachelor. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they are permitted to marry because it is better to marry than to burn, verse 9. And for those who were not bound to a wife, his judgment was that, do not seek to be bound, in verse 27. And the reason for this advisement is as follows: that Paul believed that the unmarried care for the things of the Lord instead of the things of this life, and that the unmarried care for how they may please the Lord, and that the unmarried would be happier if they were to abide after these judgments, again, based on the present distress that the Corinthian church was facing at the time. Is it therefore a sin to be married? Now, of course, the answer is no. Paul explicitly mentions that it is not a sin. Instead, he indicates that one who follows after his guidance does better than the one who continues in marriage, who does well. Some notable unmarried people in the Bible include the four friends in captivity: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They turned their heart to serve and honor God despite their captivity, and they won the favor of their overlords. The prophet Jeremiah, he was instructed not to take a wife, nor have sons or daughters, in Jeremiah 16, verse 1 to 2. And the reason for that, again, is similar to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. It is due to the distresses of the time foreseen in verse 3 to 4 of the same chapter in Jeremiah. He served productively and purposefully, trusting in God, having God's perspective, and continuing in prayer through his ministry. We note the account of Anna the prophetess. She appears only in a short passage at Jesus' infancy, in fact, at his circumcision. She was widowed only 7 years after she got married, and she stayed a widow for the rest of her days. This means, if assuming she was married in accordance with the custom of the day, she stayed unmarried for a long, long time. However, the Bible records that she departed not from the temple and served God with fastings and prayers night and day. Finally, we have the account of Mary Magdalene. Having been healed of evil spirits, she devoted herself to ministering to our Lord's needs out of her substance. Luke 8, verse 2 to 3. She was present at his death at his burial, and at his resurrection too, showing the devotion even when all the disciples and apostles had fled, she stayed on. Now, some might take this guidance a bit too far and bind where God has not bound. Paul himself warns against forbidding to marry in 1 Timothy 4, verse 1 to 3. We see in this passage where man will bind where God hasn't. Therefore, it also explicitly reiterates the idea that marriage is not to be forbidden. I guess in summary, the key points to note in this week, in the case for the unmarried, is that Paul's advice for men and women to be like himself, unmarried, are due to the distresses around him and perhaps around us today. For the purpose of focusing and serving and pleasing God, there is a potential for the married to be distracted by the cares of this life that they lose focus on God in. Remaining unmarried, however, is not for everyone. There will be those who find it necessary to have a marital relationship to be fulfilled. Being married is not in any way sinful or wrong, and might for some be more beneficial as compared with burning with passion. Forbidding to marry is also a departure from the faith. And therefore, what's the most important thing? Keeping the commandments of God, regardless of the status of the individual, whether married or unmarried, whether circumcised or uncircumcised, whether free or slave, all are to be abiding with God. 1 Corinthians 7. And so to my brethren, regardless of whether you are married or unmarried, I'd like to wish you a blessed week ahead, serving God, putting Him as the focus of our life, remembering that this life is not all there is to it. We look forward to the next one. Thank you very much and have a great week ahead.